The sound came from underneath the floor. Sarah Whitcomb sat up in the dark and listened again. Not wind, not the settling of old timber. Something was scratching at wood, slow and deliberate, somewhere below the boards where her son slept. There was nothing down there but cold earth and a winter's worth of potatoes. That was what she had told herself for 2 months, ever since the digging finished. That was what she needed to believe. She reached for the lantern and did not light it yet. 3 months earlier, every man in the valley had told her the same thing. Dig your cellar away from the house, the way it has always been done. Dig it near the tree line or past the fence, anywhere but under the floor where your boy sleeps. She had listened to all of it, and then she had done the opposite. Now something was learning the shape of her door from the outside, and she was the only one who knew it existed. The scratching stopped. Sarah counted her own breaths in the silence that followed, and somewhere beneath that silence was a question she had not let herself ask until tonight. Not whether the cellar would keep the food from rotting. She already knew it would. The question was whether she had built it close enough to save her son, or close enough to lead something straight to him. If you are listening from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are watching from. Stories like this one are still told because people remember what it costs to survive an ordinary winter. And if this kind of frontier history matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. The trouble had started long before the scratching, long before the first snow, in a September that refused to behave like September. Sarah had married into this valley, not been born to it. Her husband, Thomas Whitcomb, had known the land the way other men knew Scripture, by heart and without needing to think about it. He had read Weather in the Bend of Grass and the direction geese flew. He had died in early autumn, thrown from a horse on a ride that should have taken him an hour, and instead took his life, leaving Sarah with a boy named Eli, 7 years old, and a farm that suddenly expected her to know things she had never been taught. The first frost came 3 weeks earlier than the oldest farmers could remember. It caught the squash still small in the vine and blackened the last of the bean plants overnight. Sarah walked the rows the next morning with her breath foggy in front of her, doing arithmetic she did not want to do. What she put away already would not carry 2 people through a normal winter, let alone whatever this one intended to be. She had a small store she had built the way everyone built them, a shallow pit lined with boards, 30 paces from the house, near the old oak. It had served her husband well enough in ordinary years. But ordinary years assumed a woman could walk 30 paces through snow at midnight without worry, and assumed a wolf pack would have easier game somewhere else. That autumn, the older rancher spoke of thin deer and hungry country. 2 dogs had gone missing from a homestead 4 miles east. Nobody had proof of what took them, but nobody needed proof to feel uneasy. Eli asked her one evening, without any fear in his voice, only curiosity, what they would eat if the shed ran out before spring. Sarah did not have an answer that satisfied her, so she gave him a smaller portion of bread that night and told herself she would think of something before the ground froze hard enough to make thinking difficult. She thought of something within the week. It was not comfortable, and it was not what her husband would have chosen. But comfort was not what this winter was asking her to provide. Survival was. And survival sometimes required a decision that looked wrong to everyone who had not stood in her kitchen at 2 a.m, counting flour sacks by lantern light. The idea came to her while she was patching a gap in the floorboards near the hearth, feeling cold air rise up from the crawl space beneath the cabin. The ground under the house was dry. It had to be, or the floor would have rotted years ago. It sat slightly higher than the surrounding yard, on a shelf of earth her husband had chosen deliberately when he built the place, though he had never explained exactly why. Sarah had assumed it was simply where the wagon track happened to end. Now she wondered if Thomas had known something about that shelf of ground that she was only beginning to understand. She spent 2 days testing it the only way she knew how, without tools or books, only patience. She dug a small hole near the foundation, and watched what happened to it after a night of light rain. The water did not pool. It moved past, downhill toward the creek, the way water was supposed to move when it was not trapped. She dug another whole 30 paces out, near the old store shed, and that one held water for 2 full days before it disappeared into the mud. The ground beneath her cabin drained. The ground by the old shed did not. To Sarah, raised on plainer reasoning than most farmers around her, this meant something simple. A cellar dug under the house would stay dry through a wet winter. A cellar dug by the old shed would not, and food sitting and standing damp all season would rot as surely as food left in open air. There was a second reason, one she admitted to herself more quietly. If the food was under her own floor, she would not need to cross open ground in the dark to reach it. She would not need to listen for movement in the trees while carrying a lantern in one hand and a sack of potatoes in the other. She told her neighbor, Ezra Caldwell, what she intended to do, mostly because his land bordered hers, and she did not want him startled to find a whole opening beneath her floorboards. Ezra had farmed this valley for 30 years and buried 2 wives in it. He was not a cruel man, but he was blunt, and blunt men rarely soften their opinion for widows. "You dig under the house," he said, "and you're inviting every rat and every fox in the county to come knock on your door looking for supper. Worse than that, you're weakening ground that's holding your family's roof up. Do it the way it's always been done, Sarah, away from the house." Sarah listened to every word of it, because Ezra's reasoning was not foolish. He had reasons for what he believed, the way most doubters in this valley did. She simply had reasons of her own that carried more weight, standing in her kitchen at midnight with a hungry boy asleep down the hall. Digging began on a morning cold enough to see her own breath curl upward before it vanished. Sarah worked with a pick, a spade, and a crowbar that had belonged to Thomas, tools built for a man's shoulders that she had to relearn for her own. Eli helped where a 7-year-old could help, hauling loose soil in a bucket and stacking it well clear of the opening. Though most days he simply sat at the edge of the widening pit and asked questions she could only half answer. The first 2 feet came easily, ordinary topsoil, the kind that gave way to a spade, without much argument. Below that, the ground changed. She struck a layer of packed clay that resisted every tool she owned, a stubborn orange band that seemed determined to keep the whole project at knee depth forever. It took her 4 days to work through that clay layer, a task she had expected to take one. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her shoulders ached in ways she stopped mentioning to Eli, because mentioning them only worried him. Beneath the clay, the soil turned looser, darker, and noticeably cooler to the touch even through her gloves. This was the layer she had hoped to find, the same cold, stable earth that kept a spring house cellar cool through the height of summer. She dug the pit roughly 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, enough room to stand upright and store what she needed for a hard season. She lined the walls with stone gathered from the creek bed and scrap timber salvaged from an old fence line, not out of any formal plan, but out of the same instinct that told her wet ground would rot her stores. Loose earth walls would eventually slump inward under their own weight, especially once frost worked into them. Stone and timber held their shape. The ceiling was the part that worried her most. She needed something strong enough to carry the weight of the cabin floor above it without giving way, but she had no proper beams to spare. She used what Thomas had left behind, heavy oak planks originally meant for a barn addition he never built. Laid across iron brackets, she fashioned herself from an old wagon axle. Ezra came by twice during the digging, never to help, only to look, shake his head, and repeat some version of his warning about foxes and weakened foundations. On his second visit, he noticed something that made him pause longer than usual. He crouched at the edge of the pit and pressed his palm flat against the exposed earth wall. "Dry," he said, sounding almost offended by it. "I'll grant you that much. Dry as a bone this deep this time of year." He did not withdraw his warning about the door. He only admitted, grudgingly, that the ground itself had proven her right about one thing before the project was even finished. By the time the first true snow arrived, the cellar stood finished enough to use, though not finished enough to trust completely. Sarah built the door from salvaged barnwood, reinforced with iron strapping. She heated and bent herself over the kitchen stove, a slow and clumsy process for someone who had never worked metal in her life. The door swung on leather hinges, set into a frame she had shaped by hand, and it sat nearly flush with the floorboards above the cellar opening. Nearly flush was the problem. There was a gap along the door's lower edge, no wider than a finger, left by wood that had not yet finished seasoning and had begun to shrink unevenly in the dry cabin air. Sarah noticed on a night when the wind came hard out of the northwest, carried with it the faint, unmistakable smell of the salted venison she had stored below, curing on its hooks the way her husband had always cured meat before winter. She stood over the gap for a long moment, unable to see it in the dark, but certain it was there, feeling the cold draft slip past her ankles. Meat left hanging in open air eventually drew attention from something. That was not superstition. That was simply how a valley full of hungry animals behaved once the easy summer game thinned out. A gap the width of a finger, carrying the scent of cured meat into open wind, was an invitation Sarah had not intended to send. She woke before dawn the next morning and walked the perimeter of the cabin in the gray half-light, following the wall from corner to corner. Near the northwest side, close to where the door's gap would have vented air most directly, she found tracks pressed into the thin crust of overnight snow. They were larger than a fox, larger, she thought, than any dog she knew of in the valley. The prints circled the cabin's foundation twice before turning back toward the tree line, as though whatever made them had been deciding something and had not yet made up its mind. Sarah did not tell Eli what she found. She only told him the door needed fixing, and that he should stay indoors while she worked. He asked no questions, which frightened her more than if he had asked several. She understood then that the mistake was not choosing to dig beneath the house. Ezra had been wrong about that much, and the dry stone walls proved it daily. The mistake had been trusting green, unseasoned wood to hold its shape through a hard freeze without checking it herself every single night, the way her husband would have. Sarah spent the following 2 days correcting what the tracks had revealed, working with a patience she did not feel, but forced herself to maintain anyway. She pulled the door from its frame and packed the gap with a mixture of clay and dried moss, the same clay layer that had fought her so hard during the digging now serving a second purpose. Once packed and dried near the hearth, the mixture hardened into something close to stone, sealing the gap completely and leaving no path for scent or draft escape. She also reconsidered where the venison hung. Previously it had hung near the cellar's outer wall, closest to where warm air naturally drifted toward any small opening. She moved the meat to the far corner instead, deeper into the cellar, wrapped more tightly in cloth soaked with brine, a trick she remembered Thomas using during his own hardest winters, though she had never understood until now exactly why it mattered. "You're not just keeping it cold," she said aloud to no one, testing the idea in her own voice the way she often did when working through a problem alone. "You're keeping it quiet." Quiet, she realized, was the correct word for what she needed. Cold alone preserved the meat. But an unsealed door did not just risk letting cold air out. It risked letting scent travel outward on every gust of wind, advertising exactly what lay beneath her family's floor to anything nose enough to notice. Ezra came by on the second day of repairs, drawn perhaps by the sight of Sarah working outside in weather most sensible people avoided. He examined the packed clay seal along the door's edge without comment for a long moment. "Tracks like that," he finally said, nodding toward the faint prints still visible near the tree line, "aren't fox, and they aren't just one animal traveling alone. That's a pack testing ground, seeing what's easy." He did not offer to help further, and Sarah did not ask him to, but he lingered a while longer than his previous visits, watching her work. and before he left he made one small adjustment of his own, dragging a fallen branch across the most obvious approach path near the northwest corner. "Won't stop anything determined," he admitted. "Might slow down anything just curious." It was the first thing resembling cooperation she had received from him since the digging began, and Sarah noted it without saying so, the way she noted most quiet shifts in people around her that autumn. The first real test came not from wolves, but from a single fox, 3 nights after the door was resealed. Sarah woke to the sound of Eli's dog, an aging hound named Beryl, who mostly slept through winters, barking with unusual urgency near the front step. She took the lantern and found fresh, smaller tracks circling the cabin's foundation, stopping at the northwest corner exactly where the door sat below the floor, then moving away again without lingering. The fox had come close enough to investigate and found nothing worth pursuing further. No scent leaking through packed clay. No gap wide enough to interest a nose built for finding exactly that kind of weakness. It was a small victory, and Sarah understood it as exactly that, small. A fox was not a wolf pack. A single curious animal circling once was not the same as hungry animals returning across a hard winter, testing the same ground repeatedly until something gave way. Still, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet relief that morning, watching Eli eat breakfast without any awareness of what had happened outside during the night. The seal held. The correction had worked, at least against the kind of test a fox represented. She used the days that followed to strengthen what she could. She packed a second, thinner layer of clay along the door's edges as insurance against future shrinking. She checked the venison wrapping daily instead of weekly. She began sleeping with one ear turned toward the floorboards, listening for sounds she hoped never to hear again. Ezra's assessment of packed snow and cold fronts moving down from the north proved accurate within the week. Every farmer in the valley began speaking of it the same way, in the careful, clipped language people used when discussing whether that frightened them without wanting to admit fear outright. This would not be an ordinary hard winter. This would be the kind spoken of for years afterward, the kind that separated families who prepared from families who assumed preparation was optional. Sarah stood in her cellar one evening, surrounded by stores that would carry her and Eli through most of it, and allowed herself to hope that the smaller test had been the largest one this winter intended to send her. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong until the storm that followed made the earlier cold fronts look gentle by comparison. The blizzard arrived on the 4th night of February, though later, no one in the valley agreed on the exact date, only that it lasted far longer than anyone expected a single storm to last. Snow fell for 2 days without meaningful pause, followed by wind strong enough to reshape drifts overnight, burying fence lines and swallowing the wagon path entirely. Temperatures dropped low enough that Sarah kept the hearth fire burning around the clock, rationing wood with the same careful arithmetic she once applied to flour sacks. On the 3rd night of the storm, Beryl began barking again, this time with a tone Sarah had not heard from the old hound before, low and continuous, aimed at the floorboard themselves rather than the door or windows. She woke Eli and told him, calmly as she could manage, to stay near the hearth. Then she took the lantern and knelt near the section of floor directly above the cellar, listening. The scratching she heard was not subtle. It came in bursts, pausing, then resuming, accompanied by low sounds she recognized instinctively as something far larger than a fox, something moving with the confident patience of an animal that had found a scent worth pursuing seriously. She thought of the door's clay seal, packed and repacked twice already, and hoped it would hold under sustained pressure the way it held under a single curious fox. Eli's voice came from behind her, quieter than she expected. "Is it under us?" "It's under the floor, not under you," Sarah answered, which was true in a narrower sense and still felt like a thin comfort against what she was hearing. The wind outside had shifted direction sometime after midnight, swinging around to blow directly from the northwest. The same direction the earlier fox tracks had originated from. The same direction Ezra had dragged his fallen branch across weeks before. Whatever now circled the cabin's foundation had arrived from familiar ground, testing a door may have investigated once already and found impenetrable. Sarah did not know, crouched there in the lantern light with her son pressed against her side, whether tonight would prove the seal strong enough for a determined pack in the depth of true hunger, or whether the smaller tests in autumn had only delayed a larger failure until the stakes were highest. The scratching continued for nearly an hour before it changed character, shifting from testing at the door's edges to something more focused, concentrated at one specific point near the lower corner, where the packed clay met older wood. Sarah recognized the spot instantly. It was the same corner that had shrunk and gapped once before, the corner she had repaired twice, the corner she had checked daily out of habit rather than any specific fear. She moved without fully deciding to move, pulling a heavy iron poker from beside the hearth and kneeling directly above the sound, pressing her palm flat against a floorboard as though she could somehow reinforce it through touch alone. The wood held, but holding was not the same as comfortable, and for several long minutes Sarah genuinely did not know which outcome she was about to witness. Eli asked no more questions. He sat close enough that she could feel him trembling, though whether from cold or fear, she could not tell and did not have room in her attention to separate. The scratching intensified once more, then paused entirely. Silence followed, long enough that Sarah began to wonder if it meant retreat or simply a change in tactics. She could not anticipate. Barrel's barking softened to a low, continuous growl, aimed steadily at the same corner, refusing to settle even as the minutes stretched onward. Near what Sarah judged to be 3 a.m, based on nothing but instinct and position of the fire's dying coals, the sounds outside finally faded, not abruptly, the way a single animal startled away, but gradually, the way a group decided together that easier ground existed elsewhere. She did not sleep again that night. She sat beside the hearth with Eli until gray light began pressing against the frost-covered window, and only then did she trust herself to check what remained of the seal below. The clay had cracked along one edge, thin fracture lines spreading from repeated pressure, but it had not broken through entirely. The door beneath it remained closed. The venison, wrapped and stored in the deepest corner, remained untouched. What had almost failed was not the engineering itself. It was a margin she had allowed herself for error, a margin thinner than she had realized until tested by something patient enough to find it. Morning brought clear, brutally cold air, the kind that follows a storm once wind finally exhausts itself. Sarah stepped outside before checking anything else, needing to see with daylight what darkness and fear had only let her imagine. The tracks circling her cabin's foundation were unmistakable now, deep and numerous, overlapping in places where more than one animal had paced the same ground repeatedly through the night. They concentrated most heavily near the northwest corner, exactly where the clay seal had cracked under pressure, before turning away and receding toward the tree line in a pattern that suggested retreat rather than pursuit interrupted. Ezra arrived within the hour, having noticed the same tracks crossing the boundary between their two properties. He walked the perimeter slowly, crouching twice to examine prints more closely, saying nothing until he reached the northwest corner and saw the faint discoloration where cracked clay met older timber. "They found the door," he said, not as an accusation, simply as an observation stated plainly. "They found where the seal was weakest," Sarah corrected, because a distinction mattered to her, even exhausted as she was. The door itself never opened. Ezra studied the repair work a long moment. The layered clay, the iron strapping, the careful positioning that had kept everything essential dry and quiet through a season most farmers in the valley would later describe as the hardest in memory. He did not apologize outright for his earlier warnings, but he did something Sarah had not expected from him. He returned 2 days later with seasoned oak planking from his own stores, offering to help reinforce the door properly before the next hard freeze arrived. Word spread through the valley slowly, the way most stories did that winter, carried between families checking on each other after the blizzard passed. By spring, 2 other homesteads had begun asking Sarah how she had positioned her own cellar, what she had learned about sealing a door against scent and draft, and why dry ground mattered as much as distance from the house. Sarah never described what she had built as anything remarkable. She described it, when asked, as the only choice that made sense once she understood her own ground well enough to trust it. Eli grew older that year in ways beyond simple age, carrying with him a particular attentiveness to weather and animal tracks that neighbors sometimes remarked upon, not knowing exactly where he had learned it. The cellar itself remained beneath the cabin for years afterward, patched, reinforced, and eventually rebuilt entirely, though its first winter true testing was the one the family remembered most clearly. The valley remembered the storm that lasted 4 days. Sarah remembered a door that almost failed, and held anyway, because she had checked it one crack at a time rather than trusting it completely. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.